23,000 men, Union and Confederate, had either been killed or wounded at Antietam. And yet, for all the carnage, there was no decisive battlefield victor. At the end of the day's fighting, the Union held the high ground at the cornfield, the Bloody Lane, and Burnside Bridge. Lee gathered his remaining men and waited for McClellan's attack the next morning. It never came. One day later, Lee retreated unhindered back into Virginia.
McClellan doesn't follow up when he could have. When Lee's army escapes, people are baffled. Lincoln is beside himself. I sent you to get Lee's army, not to run him out of Maryland, but to get the army.
But remember, the Emancipation Proclamation is sitting in his desk drawer. He is desperate for a victory. And what has happened in Maryland is that an invasion of the North has been repulsed.
The rebels do retreat. And to someone living in New York or Ohio, they read their newspaper, the rebels retreated. That's a victory. It's not the kind of victory Lincoln hoped for, thought was possible, but it's certainly enough of a victory for him to issue his preliminary proclamation.
What comes out of Antietam that is most important, of course, is the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation issued 5 days after the end of the battle, the 22nd of September.
On September 22nd, Lincoln called a special meeting of his cabinet. He announced that Antietam offered an indication of divine will to proceed with emancipation, adding simply, God has decided this question in favor of the slaves.
The war began, of course, as a simple fight over preserving the Union. Is the 75-year-old United States to survive, or are we to go back to a confederated state of government? But as the war continues, I think Mr. Lincoln came to the conclusion that there was something much bigger to this war than merely preserving the Union, that this war might in essence be the recreation of a United States, with freedom replacing slavery.
However radical the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was careful not to overstep the Constitution, which still countenanced slavery. He drew instead on his legal powers as Commander-in-Chief to confiscate enemy property, in this case, the South's slaves.
The Emancipation Proclamation does not technically free anyone. It frees slaves in territory that the Union does not control. That's the important technicality. The important reality is that slaves take it to mean more than it is. They give it meaning. The proclamation confirms for slaves that this war is what they said it was from the beginning, that to go to war for Union with or without slavery, that was a ridiculous proposition. Now it is a war for freedom. Union victory means emancipation.
Now if the Confederacy loses, if the Lincoln administration is in charge when the war ends, slavery is going to be dead. That means the entire social fabric of the Confederacy is now on the table in this war. It's not going to be a war that ends with Humpty Dumpty being put back together.
Before Antietam, the great powers of Europe were on the verge of recognizing Confederate independence. In fact, on the very day of Antietam, Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, decided that one more Confederate victory would allow England to intervene on the side of the South. McClellan's victory stalled that decision. Lincoln's proclamation made it impossible.
It stops England and France dead in their tracks. They cannot come into the war to support a slaveholding nation when both empires, British and French, had only recently liberated their own slaves.
George McClellan believed that he had saved the Union at Antietam. "I fought the battle splendidly," he wrote to his wife. "It was a masterpiece of art." Abraham Lincoln did not agree. He was despondent that Lee had been allowed to escape. In the days after the battle, he traveled to Antietam to urge McClellan into action. When McClellan resisted, Lincoln removed him from command of the Army of the Potomac, this time permanently. After the setback of Antietam, Robert E. Lee continued his brilliant battlefield successes. At Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee badly beat the Union Army. Then, in June 1863, Lee once again decided to take the war north, this time to Gettysburg.
There's a sense in which the Battle of Gettysburg is Antietam Part 2. Take the war out of Virginia, take it into the North. He didn't succeed in doing that at Antietam, but he comes back the next year and he has exactly the same strategy in mind. At Gettysburg, that strategy meets its final and definitive defeat. And Lincoln, when he goes to dedicate the Gettysburg Cemetery in the November following the Battle of Gettysburg, he articulates what really could be a statement that addresses both Gettysburg and Antietam. That the struggle at Antietam, the struggle at Gettysburg, both are about this new birth of freedom.
Antietam and Gettysburg are connected. The preliminary proclamation sets in motion events that make it possible for Lincoln's great statement in the Gettysburg Address that the war is for Union and freedom, for a new birth of freedom. The Gettysburg Address follows through on the promise of Antietam, what became possible in the wake of Antietam.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.